The short films of Auguste Baron showing the arrival of a train which has 2 decks.
Breaking news. Today is April 18, 1947, and we just found out that the Truganini skeleton has been removed from the British Museum. What's the Truganini skeleton?
The Truganini skeleton was the last Aboriginal left after the Black War.
Wait, what was the Black War?
But before we begin, let's take a look at where it all takes place.
The Black War was a period of conflict between Tasmanian Aboriginal people and the European settlers that occurred between 1824 and 1832. During this time, Tasmania's geography played a significant role in shaping the courses of conflict. Tasmania is an island state of Australia located south of the mainland. It is separated from the mainland Australia by the Bass Strait. However, the settlers eventually were able to establish settlements along the coast, and this led to conflicts with the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, who had lived there on the island for over 40,000 years. The geography of Tasmania also influenced the way in which the conflicts unfolded. The rugged terrain and the dense forests provided the Aboriginal people with natural advantages, allowing them to launch surprise attacks on the settlers and retreat quickly into the bush. The European settlers, on the other hand, were hammered by their lack of knowledge of the terrain and the harsh climate. This made it difficult for them to pursue the Aboriginal people into the bush, and many of the settlers were ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of living in Tasmania.
Now that we covered the location, let's get into how this all started. The Black War was a horrific era that led to the execution of many Tasmanian Aboriginal people. The origins of this conflict may be traced back to 1772, when Tasmanian Aborigines and Europeans first made contact. At the time, French adventurer Marc-Joseph Marion du Fresnay led sailors to land on the island's east shore. Tension erupted, resulting in the death of one Aboriginal Tasmanian. Shortly after, the first European enterprises were established in Australia, and strategies such as hunting and sealing were developed. In 1788, ship migration began, resulting in increased interaction between Aborigines and Europeans, causing a significant change in Aboriginal population. As Europeans came to dwell among the Aborigines, they introduced illnesses and began to change the way things were done. Children and women were kidnapped and forced to work aboard ships as wives. Sheep were moved into grazing land that was a habitat of the Aborigines' food. Furthermore, in 1803, the British began to establish in Tasmania, with Risdon Cove being the first permanent settlement. While at war with France, it appeared that the intention of this installation was to extend the Australian colony, while also preventing the French from seizing Tasmania. By 1830, the British population in Tasmania had increased by 20,500 individuals. Military men, criminals, and a few settlers comprised this population. The Aboriginal people began to resist after a large British invasion. In addition to the annihilation of Aboriginal tribes and settlements, the British population began to rise. By 1818, the Aboriginal population had shrunk to less than 2,000 people. The British and Aborigines revolted, resulting in the most brutal battle in Australian history.
Now let's take a look at what actually happened at the Black War.
From the middle of the 1820s to the end of the 1830s, the British colonizers and the Tasmanian Aboriginal population engaged in the Black War, which was the bloodiest conflict in Australian history. The rapid growth of the British population in Tasmania, which resulted in the eradication of Aboriginal tribes in their communities, was the cause of the start of the conflict. In an effort to stop future British colonization, the Aboriginal people started to rebel, which sparked a violent battle. During the battle, Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania, Colonel George Arthur, first considered resistance soldiers as criminals and prosecuted them. As a result of the failure of this strategy, he labeled all Aboriginal resistance fighters insurgents in 1826. The violence between colonists and Aboriginals increased as soldiers and police could now raid Aboriginal encampments to capture and hold any Aborigines found. Men, women, and children were all shot on sight. All attempts to stop the fighting failed, and the settlers complained that Arthur wasn't doing enough to safeguard them and their property. An advisory Aborigines committee confronted Arthur in the latter half of 1830, prompting him to call for a levy in Massey, a widespread rebellion and military enlistment in response. This levy in Massey will be known as the Black Line Strategy. As part of the strategy, which involved forming a line across settled areas and moving south, colonists pushed Aborigines into the Tasman Peninsula so that they could be rounded up and exiled to offshore islands, ending resistance. The Aboriginal people, who were still living on their ancestral grounds, were well organized and employed guerrilla warfare strategies to cause significant amounts of damage despite their small numbers. The largest force ever mobilized against Aboriginal people anywhere in Australia started moving slowly across the landscape on October 7, 1830, with over 2,200 settlers, military, police, and convicts reporting to prearranged locations across settled districts. However, there was little success in driving Aborigines to the south, and the majority slipped into traditional lands.
Let's send it to Jalen for the aftermath.
Thank you, James. The Black War was brutal.
But just because the war was over doesn't mean that the killing of the Tasmanian population stops. That small population then remained in the settlers' control, but they will be slowly removed to the land of Wadabalia. By the end of the Black War, there were less than 300 Tasmanians remaining. In the years 1832 through 1876, when the last Aboriginal had passed, colonists formed multiple lines of defense towards the Aboriginals, with their goal being to kill or move the Aboriginal people to another area southeast of Austria, where they would later be imprisoned. Aboriginals fought to keep their people safe and alive, but they just didn't have the skills, tools, or army that the British had. The last native Aboriginal was a woman named Truganini. She fought for her people until her dying day. This was proven when she was attacked in 1839 by a communist, where she would fall victim to a gunshot wound to the head. But she would survive this attack and still made a way to make sure that the population that was left was safe. Unfortunately, she would pass on in the year 1876 at the age of 64. Some would believe that this would be the end of the Tasmanian struggle, but that would be the opposite. After Truganini passed, her skeleton was then moved to a museum in England to be shown off by the year 1904. This would cause an uproar with the individuals that knew about the Black War and the Tasmanian people. So in 1947, after a long battle with the museum, they finally got the skeleton removed.
The conflict ultimately had a devastating impact on the Aboriginal people.
It is important to remember this period in Tasmania's history and learn from it.
That's all we have for today.
Back to regularly scheduled programming.